The social media mirror. Reflective, superficial, maybe even narcissistic. We are constantly facing ourselves, actually facing the best version of ourselves and of other media users through social media. That may be because the internet today gives us countless ways and opportunities to express ourselves.
You know, that capacity is being given us by the internet, and that can change everything.
But it was not always like that.
I've been teaching at ITP, at the Interactive Telecommunications Program, for about 10 years. And the average age of my students has stayed pretty much the same. My average age has risen at the alarming rate of about 1 year per year. And so I'm in the position of teaching my own youth as ancient history, right? I have to get my students to understand what the media landscape used to be like. And I tell them all kinds of stories about what it was like. And they nod politely, and I think they believe me when I tell them these things, but I could tell they don't feel it. And the thing they really don't feel is when I say to them, in the 20th century, if you had something to say in public, you couldn't, period. Right? If you were a civilian, if you were a citizen but not a media professional, you could not broadcast a message, no matter how hard you tried. In fact, people who went out of their way to try to get messages out in public through amateur channels, right, holding up signs on the street or, by the roadside, were widely regarded as being kind of off their rockers. And that change is enormous, that anyone who wants to participate, has at least the means to participate, is a huge change.
Nowadays, various platforms provide media users with opportunities and especially with freedom to deliberate their creativity, thoughts and feelings.
They allow us to perform a successful version of ourselves.
Well, we wouldn't exist if people weren't creating content. I mean, that's the bottom line. I always tell people we're the stage. They're the performers. But I don't look at us as a service as trying to exploit that. What we're trying to do is just provide the opportunities that didn't exist before, free opportunities for them to do so. If they don't want to post to YouTube, or if they have existing content they want to take down, they're always free to do so. We're not trying to control them or their content or their experience, but we're ultimately always just trying to give them access to the platform to cost effectively distribute their content and get in front of a global audience that wasn't, I guess, aggregated before.
We want to make certain that anybody who's got something to say can say it, and anybody who wants to listen can hear, and anybody who doesn't want to listen can tune them out, which is an essential quality of freedom of expression, is the right not to listen.
So they will both enable us to take more control over our identities, as well as making us more unsure about them, because we're now performing them for the world, not just for our 2 or 3 friends in class.
Over the past couple of years, there's been a shift in values of human beings, making post-material values one of the most important values today, like self-expression and the value of exploring and finding one's true self.
Is something that started in the late 1970s already. So it's not something that's caused by social media. It has to do with rising levels of economic welfare in the world. So in other words, if you don't have to worry as much about whether you can have a roof over your head or food on the table, other things become more important, such as the environment, but also culture, the arts, and predominantly yourself. A second general reason for this has to do with the individualization of society. Who you are is much less of a given today than it was in the past, right? We have choices, we have options, and especially if you're young, those options seem endless. And it seems to matter much more. Like back in the day, you could say, well, I want to be this, but if you were from a certain family, or you lived in a certain part of the country or the world, that option just didn't exist. And for a lot of people today, they have more options. So it's very important to recognize that our need, especially for young people, to express ourselves and to share our lives with the world is not something that's produced by or caused by media. On the other hand, the development and especially the ridiculous success of social media fuels this need.
We feel this need to express ourselves to the rest of the world, and we want to have this freedom to do so. We can create an image of ourselves online, a better version of ourselves in most cases, Because we have this freedom to post whatever we want of ourselves, not because anyone tells you to, but because you want to. Nowadays, apparently, we feel this need to.
If you're young, I mean, if you're between, let's say, younger than, let's say, 25, naturally, most of the work that you're doing about yourself is about yourself. Like, most of the things you're thinking about have to do with you. I mean, once you get older and you become more part of the world, your interests tend to shift more towards the world. But if you're younger, I mean, if you're 13, 14, 15, then the world is you. And so it's logical that younger people are much more self-revealing than older people.
And while researchers show that one's personality is well established by the age of 7, we cannot deny that these various opportunities to express ourselves and to expose our best possible self can affect us, and especially the younger generation, called the Me generation by the New York Times, also known as the millennials.
I think it's going to be pretty amazing to see how the next generation, I guess, evolves, if you want to call it that, because of their access to technology.
Various sources try to tell us how this feeling of expression is the strongest with this younger generation of media users. But is this true? Can we make a distinction between the older and younger generation when it comes to the effects of heavy media use? Do millennials feel differently about themselves and the world around them due to social media? And to what extent does this affect them?
I do think they think differently, and the real question, I think, is how much of that is normal human plasticity, right? We all are really good at responding to opportunities, and this young generation has different opportunities than my generation had. And how much of it is actually that their brains are being wired differently because of exposure to the media environment they're being exposed to?
I'm a little nervous about drawing a sharp distinction between what we call, Generation Web or digital natives and older people, adults, because that lets adults off the hook, and they can say, as they always say, this younger generation, they're, going to hell or whatever.
People my age, mid-40s and up, are wringing their hands right over what kids are doing, teens are doing on Facebook. As if we would not have done those things had Facebook existed when we were young. And so we want to project this idea, I wasn't putting drunk pictures of myself up on Facebook. It's like, no one gave us the chance. But I remember us. I think we would have done that in a heartbeat if Facebook had been around. And so rather than, sitting around complaining about how young people have it better than us, which makes us look like old fogies, we decide instead that this is a threat to civilization and must be, must be addressed at once in the highest halls of power. That kind of, hypocrisy and lack of self-examination is always, alas, true of people my age and older.
And really, the effects of the internet, I think, are the same on adults as on younger kids and younger adults. And if you look at the statistics, it's people in their later 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s who are online much more of the time than, say, teenagers. So I would hate to have the focus on Generation Web, make it seem as though older people aren't affected by the internet, because I think they are. And I think what we see in young people, the distractedness, the inability to, read more than 2 pages at a time, is probably coming to characterize older people in every generation as well.
And I think for that we need help, all of us, not just, people who are perhaps less educated or something, no, but everyone.
Since we can't state that there's a big difference between the effects of social media between age groups, it's better to focus on individuals. How does this self-reflection and constant engagement with social media affect us as humans?
There's no real general consequence. I mean, for example, if you say, we suffer from information overload, 100 years ago we did that too. And some people are better than others to develop some kind of strategy to deal with this. So that differs from one person to the next.
Professor Sherry Turkle talks about this lack of reflection of oneself, and by that, breaking of this reflective mirror called social media. Because of our lack of deep thinking due to social media, and the quick responses required for every message we receive and send, we ignore to really reflect on ourselves and the message we broadcast.
They'll text, but they won't talk.
This lack of deep thinking can in ways make us as media users superficial and can make this mediated world self-centered.
The world is more and more and more and more complex. On the other hand, we're only going to ask you a question that you can answer in 2 seconds. So we leave ourselves less and less time for reflection because our communications media push us to quick responses.
I think the great value of thinking deeply and reading deeply and concentrating in general is that we begin to develop a unique personality, a unique intellect that's ours and ours alone. And that requires, I think, deep thought and in the ability to make our own associations and our own connections about things we understand deeply inside our own mind, rather than relying on the associations and connections that might be out in the world and that we might access through hyperlinks, for instance. So I really think that the human self and the human personality becomes much richer when we can slow down and when we can think deeply and engage with information in more than just kind of a cursory manner.
The consequences of this constant self-expression and engagement with social media may be that this mirror of social media can make us narcissistic, superficial, and self-centered. As researcher Laura Bafaldi shows, people with a higher score on the Narcissistic Personality Inventory questionnaire tend to have more friends on Facebook, tag themselves in photos more often, and update their statuses more frequently. Even though researcher Jean Twenge shows that there has been a general increase in narcissism among all generations, we can't state that social media is the only reason or even a reason for this increase.
In statistics, you would call that a spurious relationship. There's no real direct connection between those two things. People in general, and young people in particular, over the last 10, 20 years, score higher on narcissism scales. There's lots of different ways to look at finding like that. There are some structural developments in society, individualization, post-materialism, and all those kind of things that make us more self-aware, that makes us think more and talk more about ourselves. And frankly speaking, the way the economy is organized, where we're now all supposedly becoming entrepreneurs, and we are solely responsible for our own happiness and our own work and everything like that. It's quite clear that who we are matters. And you can even argue too that in this day and age, it's healthy to have some level of narcissism. Generally it's good to have some level of narcissism if you explain narcissism as a form of self-love or self-care.
In addition to being more narcissistic, college students today are more assertive, extrovert, and have more self-esteem than the average college student 30 years ago.
There's a dark side to all of this. The pathological definition of narcissism is not self-love, it's actually self-hate. That is masked by an over-investment in image.
If we look at the core of narcissism, which means that a person only cares about themselves and thinks they are better than anyone around them, it's hard to state and generalize that social media is the cause of this, since it's a personal disorder.
Right? We project an image of ourselves to the world that's perfect because we find ourselves ugly and imperfect. That's what narcissism in a pathological sense is, right? A narcissist is actually somebody you have to feel really sorry for, because it's somebody that cannot see themselves in the mirror. They can only see the version of themselves that they project to the outside world. It's very deceptive, or very easy to label people who share a lot of their lives online as narcissists, because we tend to share things that make us look good. If you look back at the pictures people would take from holidays in the 50s and 60s, those were always the nice pictures. You take a picture on a day when the sun is shining, not when it's raining. We'd still do the same thing. You could argue that social media amplify this need to always be good and look your best, and make us perhaps ignore or forget or tell us a story that it's not okay to also show your imperfect sides, the sides that make you human. I think what you can say is that social media do what all media do to us, which is they amplify what's already there. And so if we feel uncertain and stressed out about our identities and who we are becoming and how we are relating to other people in the world, and then social media act as a massive amplification of that. So in that sense, social media are not so much dangerous, but they have to be properly understood to be used effectively. Like, we need some tools to now and then take a step back, even though I realize that's very hard because we live in media, not with them.
Maybe this mirror is not as narcissistic and superficial as it seems, but only if you don't let the social media mirror affect your self-esteem too much and use it to a certain extent, and try to look a little deeper in this mirror sometimes. Reflect on your deep and true emotions and feelings instead of only looking at the outside.